This episode is brought to you by iZotope. Our friends over at iZotope create the most thoughtfully and intuitively designed software for audio repair, mixing, and mastering. I use their tools every day for the podcast, and I love it. And I think you will too. Go over to iZotope.com and check it out. That's iZotope.com. iZotope. Use the code FRET10 at checkout for a 10% discount. That's all caps, FRET, and the number 10.
Allow me to live and breathe like a man.
You've heard his words on classic albums like Pacific Ocean Blue and Friends. His 1969 collaboration with Brian Wilson, A World of Peace Must Come, gained almost legendary status as one of pop's most storied lost albums, before being resurrected to great acclaim by Light in the Attic in 2008. Now you're cordially invited to take a trip into the mind of poet and songwriter Stephen J. Kalinich. Heyday Again Records presents I Love My Life, a postcard from one of the last standing poets of peace and excitation. Order your copy today. I Love My Life by Stephen J. Kalinich and Friends. You'll see why heavy hitters like Brian Wilson, Dennis Wilson, Paul McCartney, Steve Cropper, P.F. Sloan, and Diana Ross have all worked with him. I Love My Life by Stephen J. Kalinich. Order today at realgonemusic.com. Again, that's realgonemusic.com. You had told me about all these tapes, and they were just an image I couldn't get out of my mind, because now the scope of the series had transmogrified into this gigantic quest. So now all of a sudden there's the opportunity for not just myself, but for you, for both of us in a conjoined way, to do a deep dive granular inquest on Pet Sounds in a way that no one has ever done. Welcome to another episode of Discograffiti's wildly in-depth Beach Boys series and Your Dreams Come True, where Brian Wilson freaks like you and me get our chance to delve deep into the barely believable history and prodigious discography of my favorite band of all time, and also coincidentally the best, along with a slew of over 50 top-shelf guests, ranging from musicians inspired by their work, family members, documentary directors, songwriting collaborators, Beach Boys authors, producers, touring band members, and for good measure, some of the Beach Boys themselves. I'm your host, Dave Gebrow, and special thanks goes out to co-producers Chuck Granata, Dennis Dyken, and Mark Freed, without whom this series would not have happened. And in this episode, we'll be turning our spray cans on the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds, along with our special guest, author and Pet Sounds expert Chuck Granata. Here's just a few of the many things that Chuck discusses in this podcast. How we wound up meeting and becoming fast friends, the origin story of Chuck's book, the ludicrous amount of incredible interviews that Chuck conducted for his book, the crazy road trip we took together to retrieve his tapes, which were in storage 10 hours away across the U.S., and a look ahead at Season 3 of The Beach Boys and Your Dreams Come True. If you're a Beach Boys superfan like me, you'll want to turn this free version off right now and opt for the director's cut of this episode on our Patreon page, which features 12 additional minutes of essential material. And you can find it in our Patreon shop for mere pennies at patreon.com/discograffiti/shop. Or better yet, just subscribe for access to the complete versions of all our shows. I recommend the Lieutenant tier at the very least, so you can access those director's cuts, because they include every last moment that was intended for these episodes. But it's actually the major tier that you want if you want it all. Discograffiti tells a story each week, and that story is 4 episodes long. And that's what you get as a major. In fact, as you'll see, the Monday bonus episodes are going to be most of the best stuff. But even if you're on the fence, just head over there, because it's finally free to become a basic member. And you don't want to miss being notified about every single one of these episodes. because coming up, we got an interview with Lenny Waronker, Denny Tedesco, and his incredible new documentary, The Immediate Family, an unprecedentedly intimate interview with Marilyn Wilson Rutherford and her cousin and Honey's bandmate Ginger Blake, Mike Love, Al Jardine, Bruce Johnston, Tony Asher, Jimmy Webb, Kim Fowley, Phil Ramone, Paul Tanner, Larry Knechtel, Don Randy, Dominic Priori, Bob Irwin, Mark Lynette, Billy Strange, Hal Blaine, Larry Levine, the Four Freshmen's manager Bill Wagner, Carol Kay, plus an incredibly special Graham Nash deep dive, in which Graham himself rates and discusses everything he's ever released. That means solo, CSN, CSNY, CNN, and for good measure, Crosby's If I Could Only Remember My Name. So don't miss out. Open up your listening app right now and subscribe. And away we go then. Today's guest is acknowledged as one of the world's foremost authorities on the music and career of Frank Sinatra. He's served as a record and radio producer, author, music historian, archivist, and policeman. His award-winning book, Sessions with Sinatra, Frank Sinatra and the Art of Recording, is considered one of the finest books written on the subject and has for years been used in the curriculum at New York University's Tisch School for the Arts. He has contributed to, annotated, supervised, and produced dozens of CD and LP reissue projects at RCA Victor, Columbia, Capitol EMI, Warner Reprise, and Impex Records. The last couple I heard were the Youngbloods' Elephant Mountain and Donovan's Hurdy-Gurdy Man, and the full package overall for both these reissues are deliciously, dazzlingly pristine. He was also, for 15 years, the producer of Nancy Sinatra's weekly Nancy for Frank program on Sirius XM Radio. He has lectured and appeared as a guest panelist at the Paley Center for Media in New York City, the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts at Lincoln Center, the Smithsonian Institution, Skidmore College and Hofstra, New York, and George Washington Universities. Amongst his cherished collaborators, this beautiful son of a gun, singer Nancy Sinatra, record producer Phil Ramone, composer-arranger Johnny Mandel, musician, vocalist, preservationist Michael Feinstein, jazz guitarist Al Di Meola, engineer and producer Tony Bongiovi, entertainer Tony Orlando, and the Doris Day Animal Foundation. If you care to ingest his dulcet tones, he hosts Sinatra Standard Time every Sunday at 2 p.m. Pacific on KSDS-FM. I can't imagine a worthier, more erudite fella to whom to pass the cherished baton, as it were, as he is the one, the only, Chuck Granata!
Hey, Dave, so good to be with you.
I want to pinch those cheeks every friggin' time I see you.
I want to lose these cheeks, my friend.
You're on your way, my man. I gain as you lose. That's how we work.
Well, this is really a wonderful opportunity for me because, as you know, I love the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson and Pet Sounds. And I've spent pretty much my whole life listening and preparing for this moment. And here we are. This very
moment?
Yeah, I think so.
I think, you know what, honestly, I think so too, but I didn't want to come off like, an ego-slathered son of a bitch. But honestly, your book is amazing. And this episode, actually, do you know what I've titled it?
No.
Wouldn't it be nice if Chuck Granata gave me all his Pet Sounds interviews?
That's great. You're a good parodist. That's excellent. You get good marks for that.
I'm the Weird Al of Who Gives a Shit.
Me too. I can think of parody lyrics for just about anything.
Before we actually get into the meat of the record, I wanted to do an episode about your book, about your tapes, and about our relationship, because this is not a normal kind of situation, what has sprung up, over the last month or two. And so just as you so eloquently always set the scene appropriately so people get a multi-sensual approach, in the introduction, I didn't actually talk about the Pet Sounds book at length because I knew we were certainly going to touch on that. But your book is Wouldn't It Be Nice? Brian Wilson and the Making of the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. And in my research, as I was transitioning from season 2 into season 3, I had sort of an amorphous plan about what I was going to do. Some of the episodes I knew for sure, some of the interview subjects, I knew who I was going to contact, but I bought your book. I found it on Amazon and I was reading the back cover. I saw your bio, like a small version of your bio. And the last sentence of it is, he divides his time between Los Angeles and Livingston, New Jersey. And I had to reread that a number of times because I couldn't really believe my eyes. I live in Livingston, New Jersey. And that instant, I started stalking you. I looked online to see if I could find your number. I did find your number, and I immediately left a message with you. I believe it was the next morning. You called me back. We talked. It turned out that you actually knew my dad, which I didn't even know. Somehow, in the course of things, oddly, we never crossed paths. In fact, we had never heard of each other, which seems unlikely, especially because I have been arrested several times in this town and by friends of yours as well. Right?
That is true. That is true.
Officer Dave Minto, who's a friend of yours, you
Yes.
came up with him in the academy. He arrested me once. I've been arrested 4 times total, but 3 times in Livingston specifically.
And I have never been arrested.
And you've never been arrested. In fact, you are a law-abiding citizen for the most part. Anyway, that next morning we talked. Then we met for breakfast a few days later, maybe a day later, with Dennis Dyken. It was the 3 of us, and we sat there for hours.
We did. It was a really great conversation and breakfast and lunch. And, I had met Dennis because I was friendly with some of his bandmates from the Smithereens. And when you told me that Dennis was producing with you, I was really happy because I love the Smithereens. Dennis is such a great guy. He's such a great music historian, and not just of rock and roll music. He knows jazz. He knows big bands. He's really a musically Renaissance guy. So that morning was really one of the most incredible musical conversations I think I've ever had. And I've had some pretty good musical conversations. And, we just were shooting back and forth and we got each other. We understood. And boy, I was sold on whatever you were doing.
And it really could have gone all day. If I remember correctly, it was a 4-hour breakfast.
It was. And I think Dennis didn't want to leave.
He didn't.
I mean, I don't think any of us wanted to leave.
Well,
right.
In a lot of ways, we haven't left. Since that day, you and I became fast friends. You and I started walking together. You wrestled with diabetes, and you actually got a glucose monitor because of me, or at least I helped inspire that decision. And I was going through the only period in the last 11 years where I ate sugar. Because my mom passed away, I was going to hell in a handbasket with my eating habits at the time, when you were actually entering into a period of eating phenomenally well. And I was going through a massive fuck it period.
Well, isn't it funny when you're diabetic, especially, how stress affects you? Because my dad passed away in December, and my brother and I had to clean out and sell his home, our boyhood home. And, I just wasn't eating properly. I was not sleeping properly. And of course, I was grieving. And, it was right around the same time that we experienced that. And my sugar really spiked. I mean, I think my A1C was at an all-time high of 14. And my doctor said, you better do something.
For anyone who doesn't know out there, an A1C of 14 is basically admittance into a hospital.
Yeah. So I said to him, just give me a month or 2. I know that I've been eating really poorly. I haven't been sleeping well. I'll try and turn this around. And I immediately that day, the moment I walked out of that office, I just swore off all starches and anything that had carbs and sugar. that was not good for me. And it's really served me well. And I did get a glucose monitor. I have a Libra, and it's just phenomenal. It really keeps me in check and gives me a much better picture of how I'm doing on an hourly basis. So it really has changed my life in a lot of ways.
And as we're entering into this, the beginning of our friendship, it's kind of like this guy, you've been here for God knows how many decades, and you're actually moving to North Carolina. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to just take revenge on him for, leaving me in the lurch by, trying to take up every last second of his time in Livingston until he's gone and make him not miss me at all. And that, in fact, is what I have tried and succeeded in doing. But before we get to that part of our relationship, because that's after this topic, which I want to spend more than a beat on, tell me about your book, why you're literally the perfect candidate, basically, for being season 3 of the Beach Boys series Overlord, the only person that I would ever pass the baton to and, allow me to just kind of sit in the background as more of a curator than an actual creator and presenter. Talk to me about your book.
Well, I had written my Frank Sinatra book, and it was definitely a unique book. I took the approach of, here's an artist who immersed himself in every facet of the creation of his art. He selected the songs. He selected the arranger. He selected specific soloists for the recording sessions. He sat down with the arranger and detailed exactly what he wanted to hear behind him musically in the recording studio when he arrived, sometimes months later. So I really had delved into an artist who was more of a producer, even though he wasn't credited as the producer. Frank Sinatra really produced his own records in so many ways. So I write this book, and it gets really great reviews. And my editor calls me and he says, what's next? What would you really love to do? And I had the answer already. I said, I'd like to write a book about Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, because to me, Brian Wilson is the modern pop equivalent of Frank Sinatra. In fact, in many ways, he might even be beyond Sinatra, simply because Brian actually created the arrangements himself. He said, that's perfect. He said, because I'm working with a publisher in England, and they're doing a series of books on classic albums. And one of the albums that they want to do is Pet Sounds. And I said, where do I sign? I think I spent that first night worried that I wasn't going to get the gig, because I knew it was right where I wanted to be. And the next morning I got the call, and he said, hey, we'd love to have you aboard, and let's do it. It was called the Vinyl Frontier series, and they had done the White Album. I think they did Are You Experienced by Jimi Hendrix, one or two other albums, and my Pet Sounds book. And I dove into researching this record, and of course, all the participants, as much as I did and as deeply as I did, Frank Sinatra. The good thing for me, Dave, was that I knew some of the players already, because I was close friends with Nancy Sinatra and I was working with her on some projects. I got to know Don Randy and Carol Kay and Hal Blaine. So it really wasn't difficult for me to pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, it's Chuck Granata, and I'm diving into this whole Pet Sounds topic. Can you help me out? And all of them did. This whole idea of doing a Beach Boys book came to me when I was staying in Los Angeles on a business trip. I was there for 2 or 3 weeks, and I was staying at a little hotel in Beverly Hills. And as we do when we're in the industry, when we make a trip like that, we visit our friends and our colleagues at various record labels. And I had gone to Capitol Records earlier in the day, where, of course, as a visiting reissue producer / writer and friend, I was allowed to raid the product cabinet, which I was very good at. So one of the things that the gentleman at the label gave me was this box set, the Pet Sounds Anniversary box set. Now, you know me, and anyone who knows me knows I am not a good sleeper. So I'm back at the hotel, and it's probably about 1:30 in the morning, and I can't sleep. So I said to myself, hey, I'm just going to get up. I started looking at CDs, And at the time, we had those Discmen. And I kind of said to myself, hey, you know what? I'm wide awake. This box set looks so good. I'm going to take a couple CDs and I'm going to go for a walk. And I left at like 2 a.m. and I went for this 3-hour walk around Beverly Hills, right around the Wilshire Boulevard area, but those neighborhoods on Spalding and then behind there. And it was such a nice thing to do because I got to listen while I'm walking and seeing all these beautiful homes that are lit up and nobody's around. And that is what gave me the inspiration. I'm listening and I'm saying, man, this is exactly what I wrote about Sinatra. I detailed how he did this, the behind the scenes. And here are these wonderful session recordings of Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys. So I immediately said to myself, I have to do a Beach Boys book, a Brian Wilson book. And that was really my inspiration. It was David Leaf's work on the Pet Sounds box set. And I didn't really know David Leaf at that point.
So did you feel reading David's liner notes in the Pet Sounds box set that there was still room to expound on what he had done?
Yes, because, my approach and my interest, not necessarily interest, but my specific area of expertise is really taking the technical and marrying it with the artistic. So that's why I did my Sinatra book in a way that no one else had ever done anything on Sinatra. I interwove the technology of recording and how it grew along with Sinatra, and hence allowed us to appreciate his art on a much deeper sonic level as recording technology improved. And I felt I could do the same thing with Brian because he used the primitive multi-track technology, 3 and 4 track, in a way that very few other people had done in crafting Pet Sounds. So there was this nexus there. And David's notes were excellent. The presentation was excellent. What was concluded was excellent. What I felt myself doing when I sat down and read the book that was in the Pet Sounds box set was reading the interviews with some of the musicians and participants and saying to myself, I wonder why these are not edited. And I also said to myself, that's a great answer, but there's no follow-up. Like Chuck Granata, would have followed it up with this question because I want to know more about how Carol Kay hears herself when she's in the studio and they're actually recording her bass.
I want to say that, to be totally honest, your work is so conclusive that I have not even utilized the Pet Sounds book at all for this season, at all.
That's interesting. I just felt that I could do what I did for Sinatra and do, a good 2-hour interview with the key people and just put it in a different context. David didn't have that mindset of locking in the technical with the creative in such a deep way. He was trying to give an overall view. And that was really the start for me. I just, I started with the people who I knew. I called Carol Kay and I called Hal Blaine and I called Don Randy, all people who had known about my work, some of whom I had interviewed for the Sinatra book and who had an affiliation with Nancy Sinatra because they played on her records and they were close friends. So that was really the start of it.
Oh, hi, I'm Dave Gebrow. I threw my career as a licensed hearing instrument specialist in the trash, sold my house, and moved to the East Coast with my wife and 5-year-old son in order to focus on making the ultimate weekly podcast for music obsessives thrive. But weekly wasn't enough for me, so I bumped it up to 4 shows a week. Becoming a subscriber to Discograffiti's Patreon gives you access to hundreds of exclusive episodes. As a 2-show per week private, you get the weekly show by and for our Patreon family, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast. As a 3-show-a-week lieutenant, you'll get early release, ad-free, extended director's cuts of the main show. They're the shows as they were intended to be heard. Plus, you'll gain access to half the Patreon archive and the upcoming Beach Boys Behind the Mirror companion episodes, which will feature dozens of special guests from within the Beach Boys camp talking about and rating their music. But as a 4-show-per-week major, you'll be drowning in a flood of must-hear binge listening, because I'll be bombarding you with episodes about super cool bands that are too subterranean for free Fridays. It's like going to music college, but with a tuition that makes all kinds of sense. Plus, our entire Patreon archive is yours. Discograffiti's Top 10, our Buried Treasure show, Rock Cousteau, our Slag Off show, Queasy Listening, and the Private Press with Paul Major. And all that for the price of only a cup of coffee a week. Times are tough, you say? Fret not, because there's a $1 tier. Or you could just join as a basic member and buy episodes piecemeal from our Patreon shop. Don't risk feeling badly about yourself by not giving. Check out patreon.com/discograffiti to find the tier that's right for you. Once again, that's patreon.com/discograffiti. This episode is brought to you in part by Bespoke LA. Located in the Fairfax district of Los Angeles, Bespoke LA is the modern podcaster's dream come true. It's got 2 podcast pods available, one with audio only and the other with both audio and video. Just think, you can start your own podcast tomorrow without investing a single penny in equipment. What, you don't have experience editing? Don't even sweat it. For an additional fee, Bespoke LA can edit your podcast. Or not, it's entirely up to you. Rates start at $75 an hour with discounts if you book 4 sessions at once. Go to bespokela.com/podcast. That's BSPOKELA.com/podcast for more information or to book your time today. And be sure to tell them that Dave sent you for a one-time 25% discount. What was the full span of time in which the interviews took place?
I think it started in the beginning of 2001 and probably went until the end of 2002 because my book came out at the end of 2003.
Okay. I didn't realize it was such a long time, but yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot of people here.
I took my time. I didn't feel that I had to be rushed. And as you can tell, and as our listeners will be able to tell shortly, I really kept things conversational. I wasn't planning on doing an interview for a podcast, which hadn't been invented yet. I did think, and I did record them in a way that I could use them on a radio program, but I just wanted to have a very open, honest, and meandering conversation with these subjects.
You had told me about all these tapes, and they were just an image I couldn't get out of my mind because now the scope of the series had transmogrified into this gigantic quest. So now all of a sudden, there's the opportunity for not just myself, but for you, for both of us, in a conjoined way, to do a deep dive granular inquest on Pet Sounds in a way that no one has ever done. Because now we not only have all your tapes, we have, all the stuff that I'm adding into it as well. There's going to be other types of episodes that I have not done yet. There will be full episodes that only take place in the studio and are composed of just Beach Boy chatter around vocal sessions. There's going to be all kinds of stuff that's going to leave someone with a very solid view of what Pet Sounds is or what it could represent. And at this point, the tapes were not in Livingston, New Jersey. They were sitting like some music nerd treasure chest, crushed under thousands of pounds of bric-a-brac, all the way down south in a storage facility in North Carolina. So there was a sort of amorphous idea, at least when it was pitched at that breakfast, of you and I going south. Or you may have thought it was amorphous, but in my mind, I was ready to really jump into the car that day. I mean, it was definitely that important, and I would have done it at any point. And I don't think it took us a long time to actually get our act together and go down there. And we did. We jumped in the car. And in fact, the road trip itself was pretty insane. I've had some insane road trips. I once drove 21 and a half hours nonstop from Lawrence, Kansas to Livingston, New Jersey, stopping only for fuel. But I was younger. I was 24. Here we are, a couple of middle-aged dudes, and we did it like kids because we drove down I think it was a little bit longer going down there, right?
About 10 hours, 10 and a half hours.
10 hours. We split the driving going down, but nonstop. And then we get there, and there were a couple guys who were helping us, but it was all the way in the back of a storage facility. First, we emptied out one, and then you realized that might be in a different one, right?
Right.
So we had to
That's
go to
right.
a different storage unit. A lot of boxes were removed before we actually discovered the box. And there it was. It was like the fucking suitcase in Pulp Fiction. It almost emitted a similar type glow on my face when I lifted the lid. And reading those names that graced the spines of each of the mini discs, I took in the scope of what I was seeing here. Now, keep in mind, a lot of these people on these interviews are either deceased or are all talked out on Pet Sounds and no longer do interviews on the subject. But here is a list of the names who've spoken to you for the book. And by the way, there's others as well. There's music historians and teachers and other people that I'm not going to use, but these are the ones that I'll be using and will be appearing on Discograffiti in the coming months, with me only doing an introductory piece, but then Chuck and the interview subject taking it the rest of the way. Tony Asher, in what I consider to be the most revealing and important interview that he's ever given on the subject, including David Lee. For me, it's really the directness and, just how germane the questions and the answers are, because he's going track for track and really kind of exhaustively explaining where all these songs came from, how they came about, and you really feel like you're in that house. You feel like you're there with Brian and Tony, and you're peering over their shoulders, watching them write this peerless material. You're there with them. So Tony Asher was, for me, the cream of the crop. Hal Blaine, there's a multi-parted Hal Blaine thing while he's in a residential community. So it's kind of in his waning days, I believe. A multi-parted Bruce Johnston piece. Hours of Bruce Johnston. Larry Levine, who has since passed away. Larry Levine was the main engineer on Smile. And you have a multi-parted and phenomenal Carol Kay interview that stands as the best Carol Kay interview that I've heard. You have Mike Love, you have Al Jardine, Jimmy Webb, Kim Fowley, Ross Barber of the Four Freshmen, Phil Ramone, Paul Tanner, who was the electrothereminist who played on Good Vibrations, Wild Honey, and I Just Wasn't Made for These Times, Larry Knechtel, Don Randy, Dominic Priori, Bob Irwin, Tommy Morgan, who's the bass harmonica player on all these sessions, Sid Sharp.
Now, I have interviewed Paul McCartney, but I didn't interview Paul for the Beach Boys book. However, Paul has gone on record as saying that Pet Sounds really was an inspiration for them, as their records were for Brian.
And we're on a quest to get him for this season.
I'm hoping that we can do that. I'm on it.
My goal for this season is definitely to have McCartney in some way, shape, or form becoming a part of this thing. So here are the remaining people that we haven't spoken about yet. Alan Robinson, who was the French horn player on God Only Knows, etc., and had like a photographic memory, not just photographic, but multi-sensual. He kind of remembered everything.
He blew me away.
Mark Lynette, Billy Strange, Lyle Ritz, and lastly, an interview that really surprised me, the Four Freshmen's manager, Bill Wagner. It's not an incredibly long interview. When I edited it, I think the final version is about a half hour, but it is very emotional, and it spans the length of time from when Brian first walked into Bill's office and basically just sat there trying to be a barnacle on the Four Freshmen's hub, to when Brian first started taking LSD and Bill got a sense of, the left turn that Brian's life had just taken. And, since we came back from that trip, things have changed in quick order. You sold your house. You bought a gorgeous place down south. And so this is all being pulled together during an extremely chaotic time in your life. You have not only just sent me these tapes, it's not like we just came back with the mini discs and you said, here you go. You're filtering the tapes to improve the fidelity overall. And if a tape comes to me, like, for example, I heard that the Sid Sharp tape was overmodulated, so you're going to actually actually redo it. So the amount of work on your end, even, never mind, the editing that I'm doing, but what you're doing to improve the fidelity overall and to preserve the work that you've done, because keep in mind, broadcast was not the central purpose for these tapes. So a bit of work had to be done to get the tapes up to speed and Discograffiti worthy. So Chuck, thank you so much for all the hard work and for the hard work to come, because we're probably a little bit more than halfway through, but there's still, work to come there. And also, I want to say that even though this project builds on the book, you can purchase his book, and you should purchase his book. It's called Wouldn't It Be Nice? Brian Wilson and the Making of the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. And there should be a link right there in the show notes where you can just click away and order it for yourself. Before we talk about how this season's going to roll out, I want you to be honest and talk about either how annoyingly persistent I've been or about how persistently annoying I am.
I would say neither and neither. You remind me of myself when I was a maniac back when I was in my 30s and 40s and early 50s. And I could burn the candle at both ends, so to speak. I was working as a cop and then bouncing in and out of the city, doing interviews for Sinatra books. And then I would work all day and then stay up half the night until 3 a.m. writing because, I had coached my kids in soccer and softball. And, I was a dad and I was a husband and I had to take care of those things. And once everyone was settled for the night at 9 or 10 o'clock, I could sit at the kitchen table and I could write and I could research. And this is in the very early days of the internet. So it was a lot for me, but I was able to work on a few hours sleep and I was able to do all these things. At the same time, I was producing CD reissues for Sony Music and doing other things, radio. But I
know I'm annoying you. There's nothing you can say that won't convince me.
You're not. No, I love your passion and I love that you follow up and I love that you have this energy that I just don't have anymore. I want to have that energy. I just can't, I can't.
It's been 3.5 years nonstop there's been not a single day where I didn't step away from that intensity. And the best thing that I can say about that particular emotional state is that it's not about me. It's really not about me. It's about the show, and the show is bigger than me. And I'm trying to feed the show because, look, Pet Sounds is my second favorite album of all time. Smile is my favorite album of all time. If I do any of these records or artists, if I do them any kind of a disservice, I will never forgive myself. To me, that is an unforgivable slight, and I could never live with that.
Well, there's no way that anyone could attach the word disservice to what you do because I really don't know anyone, maybe other than myself, in terms of thinking about how to present the story, not just as a written piece, but as an oral piece that has put the kind of time and effort and thought about detail into everything you do that you do. It's pretty amazing. Look at the Moby Grape series. I know about Moby Grape. My friend Bob Irwin was working on Moby Grape CDs in that early CD period when I was working on Sinatra at Sony Music Legacy Recordings. So I listened to Moby Grape and I enjoyed it. But you really, you just took this dirty window and cleaned it off to a point where it's pristine enough that we get to see every little flaw on the picture. But it's done in such a reverent way and an honest way, which is why you get the participants, the artists themselves, on Discograffiti, which, that's a big kudos, man. That's an amazing thing. So for me, Bruce Johnston recognized that I was taking this 10 steps further than what he was accustomed to with a standard interview that he gave probably 1,000 times in the Beach Boys years. Graham Nash is recognizing that if there's someone who's going to take a deep dive into his work and look at everything he's done, it's you. Yeah. So, I think you can't suppress the genuine passion you have. And that's what I get when I listen to any episode of Discograffiti. It doesn't matter what it is.
I appreciate that. I also know that, in terms of how I conduct my personal life, it crosses the line to where it winds up being a lot for people to handle and deal with. And there's not a hell of a lot I can do about that.
It's not a lot for me, so you're not overwhelming me.
Good.
So don't worry about that. It has been a little bit of a challenging time. My dad passed away in December. We were already in the midst of preparing his house to sell. We sold his house. He died. Then we decided it was the right time to sell our house and buy a new one in another state. I'm still going to be in New Jersey, so you're not getting rid of me, David. My girls are here in New Jersey. I have a very, very solid group of close friends here who I love spending time with every week. So, every couple of weeks, I'm going to fly up or drive up and spend a week or so. And I'm going to be a bi-state person for a while, for sure.
Good. Well, just a peek ahead into this season. So last week, we presented Graham Nash talking about Pet Sounds' influence, and I'm currently editing all of Chuck's material like mad. This season is going to be a lot different. First off, a lot of it will be carried by Chuck, since a lot of the interviews, not all of them, but I would say most of them, have already been conducted by him, and there's no need for me to do, let's say, a Tony Asher interview when he has already done what I consider to be the ultimate Tony Asher interview. So although we have such incredibly differing interview styles, a lot of the work you did cannot really be improved upon, and this series and the show in general is definitely no ego trip on my part. I know when to shut the fuck up and step aside, and the massive amount of terrific work that you've put in and the shelved nature of these tapes where you've just pulled for your book but haven't really utilized to their full potential, seeing as their final form was always intended as grist for a book project, makes this a kismet-based relationship that couldn't be any more perfectly timed. So there will be less of me during a large swath of season 3, and it's going to be a long season. Plus, it's only going to be centered on Pet Sounds. Initially, it was going to be Pet Sounds, Good Vibrations, and Smile. But there's so much on Pet Sounds that we're just going to keep it contained in the Pet Sounds universe. In addition, Graham Nash will be swirled in and blended with this series. It's going to be back and forth between Graham Nash, Pet Sounds, Graham Nash, Pet Sounds, to give it texture and variety. So it's going to be amazing. It'll be a truly special, once-in-a-lifetime event, especially seeing as a number of the folks that you interviewed, Chuck, either, like I said, don't speak about Pet Sounds any longer or even are deceased. And on a few occasions, you have unquestionably, as far as I'm concerned, captured the best interview I've ever heard by that participant. So it's going to be an incredible run. I don't know how it's going to look, but I do know that we're not going to be past Pet Sounds for a long time. So buckle in, get ready, because this is going to be the biggest deep dive, the most all-encompassing, the most all-pervasive and granular deep dive on Pet Sounds that has literally ever been undertaken.
Well, I am truly honored, and it's a privilege to be working with you on this, David. When I thought about recording my interviews, which I always do, when I started with Sinatra, I said to myself, I'm going to be interviewing people on the telephone. This is way before computer audio and being able to do Zoom. So I went out and purchased a professional phone tap machine, an apparatus that radio stations would use to tap a phone conversation. So I really tried to record them in the best sound possible with an ear towards using them in the future, at least the Sinatra ones, for some type of radio broadcast. And I carried that into the Pet Sounds book, of course. So, the fact that I have these, they are primarily from telephone interviews, but they're the best telephone sound interviews you're going to find, because most phone interviews are pretty raw and pretty bad. These are the best that you're going to find in terms of the sonic quality, even though we did have to do some processing on them. But, more than that, I'm really, really thrilled that these interviews are useful. and that they'll be heard.
I mean, I really appreciate it. It would still have been a great season, but it certainly would not be close to the season that it's going to wind up being now.
Well, listen, I love to collaborate and I love to cooperate and I love to share. So we're in bed together, so to speak.
And those aren't pillows. All right, that about does it. Stay tuned, because next week brings upon us part 1 of my interview with 2/3 of the Honeys, Ginger Blake and Marilyn Wilson Rutherford, the latter of whom was married to Brian Wilson throughout the 1960s and 1970s. This 4-hour interview is the deepest dive ever into the Beach Boys' sister group's entire discography, and includes some amazing and beautiful tales about living with Brian while he was operating at his creative peak. Okay, here's the week up ahead. This Sunday, our weekly show within a show, the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound podcast, drops for our Patreon's private tier. These are real people with talent and a burning fire deep inside, just like you and I. Then come Monday, the major tier gets a very special treat. And man, do I mean special. Monday's bonus episode is part 6 of our conversation with Moby Grape and Skip Spence biographer Cam Cobb on the life of Skippy. In this, the final chapter of our 12-episode Grape Expectations series, we wrap things up with a cataloging of Skip's consistently interesting musical accomplishments throughout the 1980s and 1990s, because the man absolutely never stopped. There will be a very short sneak peek running publicly for free on Monday morning, but the entirety of the show will only be accessible on the major tier of our Patreon. Don't miss it, or you'll only be getting part of the story. And then on Wednesday, the Lieutenant tier gets their early release, ad-free, super extended director's cut of part 1 of the Honeys podcast. It's the episode as it was truly intended to be heard, with all the essentials left intact. And then come Friday, everybody else gets to join in on the action. A heartfelt Discograffiti thanks goes out to my beautiful wife and son, Jen and Mason, Chuck Granata, Rudy Fishman, Becky Boyd, Jay Schultz, Bespoke LA, my mom, my dad, Joe Kennedy for that killer new theme song, my incredibly loyal fans, and especially the entire Patreon community, the Soldiers of Sound. I love every last one of you, and this show would not exist without you, my friends. Speaking of friends, it's high time for some new ones. They're in our Facebook group, Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound. That's the best way to find out what's coming up on the show, but there's a hell of a lot more. You get recaps of the day in music history, the ability to pitch questions to guests, polls that put you in the driver's seat on guest and band decisions, access to a thriving creative hub if you're looking for a collaborator, and much, much more. So make sure you don't miss out. You can find the link to the Discograffiti Soldiers of Sound Facebook page right there in the show notes. And if you don't mess with the Zuck, no sweat. Just email me at info@discograffiti.com and I'll keep you in the loop. So now that it's done and you want more, another way to dive even deeper into the classic rock and roll from the 1960s is to go to the Beach Boys Season 1, Catch a Wave, 1961 to 1964, from episode 189 on, the Righteous Brothers Bill Medley interview, that's 181 and 182, my interview with the Free Design, that's 160 to 162, my epic interview with the Mamas and Papas Michelle Phillips, that's 141 to 159, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, that's 137, my 12-hour interview with Terry Kirkman and Jules Alexander from the Association, that's 109 to 113, Vashti Bunyan reading her entire output, that's 103 to 104, Sergio Diaz from Os Mutantes, that's 86 and 87, Bert Summer, that's 83 and 84, Sweetwater is episode 79, a tribute to David Crosby, 77 and 78, Andrew Tuttle rates the Monks, 74, Jim Florentine on Black Sabbath is 64 to 68, Lou Barlow on the Zombies is 59 and 60, Marvin Gaye biographer David Ritz rates Marvin Gaye, that's 45 to 47. Blind Faith is 43. Anthony Fantano rates the Velvet Underground as 32 and 33. Bob Forrest rates the band as 25 and 27. Monkees manager Andrew Sandoval rates the Monkees, that's 22 and 23. Don Randy rates David Axelrod as 17. Badfinger is 16. The Bee Gees is 10 and 11. Sly and the Family Stone is 5, 6, and 7. And Pink Floyd is 1 and 2. And of course, be sure to mark your calendars, because next Friday, July 11th, we're coming at you with the Honeys Part 1. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss it. And so, from now till then, don't let our youth go to waste, lads and ladies. It's Discograffiti!